Welcome to the Ask Sensei Tony podcast, where Sensei will address your questions about life from the cosmic perspective. Please subscribe and ask a question at AskSenseiTony.com to find out more about studying with Sensei privately, becoming a part of our spiritual community, and training to become a mindful minister of oneness in our seminary. We hope you enjoy this episode and find it helpful.
Hi, this is Ask Sensei Tony, and today's question comes from Martin. And Martin says, how do I deal with negative comments on social media? Well, that's a very, what can I say? That's a very current, timely topic. Before we had certain things like social media, the way that we did things socially was that, usually you had to go somewhere to participate in a group or something of that nature. For most of us growing up, that would have been school. Our first environment socially would be our family, but then it would have been possibly when we went to school, or if we had a family that was religiously observant, it would be our faith community. And then successively that sort of expanded, and that went from, just being involved in those kind of groups to maybe being involved in extracurricular programs. Like when I was a kid, the YMCA had I think it was called the Little Indians, and, of course there's the Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, et cetera, et cetera. And then of course there's athletic activities and sports that everybody kind of gets involved in, probably too much today, in my opinion. When I hear some of the schedules that some of the parents share with me, it sounds a bit manic and a little out of balance. But, people are very busy today. But those social circles were always pretty much contained in that sense. Now, as anyone knows, in a social circle, the biggest thing that humans have a tendency towards is curiosity. So while they are, looking to interact with people on a variety of levels for a variety of different reasons, all of our brains have been shaped to sort of filter out anything that's not dangerous or fearful or novel or new. And so what that has a tendency for people to do is to make them more curious about those things. So what that does then is it creates gossip. And we've all heard the admonitions from the time, at least the time I was little, that gossiping is not a good thing to do. But it happens a lot, and it's somewhat of a natural conditioning in this, because we're curious about things that are dangerous and fearful, and we're also curious about new things. And if you think about it, the first exposure to media we had was, through television and through news outlets. And what did those news outlets do? Well, they usually had three sections. They had sections on things that were new and novel. They had things that were dangerous or fearful. And then there were, editorial opinions, so-called, which were basically gossiping situations, right? They might have thrown in some comics and sports, but you get the picture. So this is nothing new. So all we've done is we've just expanded the technology that we have, so that now people can interact with each other online and with much larger groups, and certainly with very little personal contact, except maybe through message boards, etc., Twitter, those kind of communications. And again, I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I'm not a Luddite, and that's a fancy word for someone who's anti-technology. I'm really not. I think what happens with any new technology, there's a process we go through where we learn to let the technology serve us rather than us serving it. But that's entirely possible, I think, all along the chain of that development. But there's one thing that's unique about social media and online presence is that anonymity is something that is much more possible. So, in other words, whereas when I was in a social group, it was hard for me to say or do something unless, I was right there. So you were right there in front of me. Now, that didn't prevent anonymous things from happening. And usually the way that would occur was that someone might say something unkind or some kind of gossip, and that would get spread around, maybe behind me, and, it would impact me. But the anonymity was less, only in that, I could probably figure out who the group was, who the people were. Today, that's not true. And so you have this phenomena where they even have a word for it. They call it trolling or trolls. And if you remember where that comes from fairy tales and different legends that come out of Europe, where trolls were basically people that lived under bridges, or creatures that lived under bridges, and monsters, I guess you could say, of sorts. But they were usually protective of something, and they were usually like had to, in order to cross a bridge or to get from one place to another, you had to address the troll, or the troll would give you some sort of test or something of that nature, right? Now, if you look at fairy tales, or you look at those kinds of stories literally, well, then it's just a fantasy tale. But if you look at them more archetypically, or you maybe look at them psychologically, there's a meaning there. So the person, if you look at it in terms of what it might mean from a mythic point of view or a psychological point of view, the bridge represents something that I'm trying to get across to. I'm trying to get from point A to point B, for whatever reason that might be. And the troll represents someone who's thwarting that. They're getting in the way of that situation. And what that can mean is that when I'm trying to get from one thing to another, whether it's I'm trying to find, I don't have information or knowledge, and I'm trying to get to a place where I have information and knowledge, or I have a goal, or I'm trying to get to that goal, but I haven't reached it yet. The troll represents, in this case, the things that are kind of blocking my way, and I have to overcome them in order to get to the place I want to be. Now, that's the traditional meaning of trolls. Troll now has been used as a word for people who kind of go on and say things, whether it's on Twitter or Facebook or whatever it might be. We have Instagram, we have Reddit, we have so many today, and they say things that are very unkind, or they kind of just speak their mind and not really think about the consequences of what they're saying. And so, and then maybe even kind of pick on and kind of continue to harass someone. And they do this, as I said, thinking that anonymity makes it okay. It's sort of like what happens in vehicles. For some reason, people think that when they're in their car, nobody can see them. And so there's I'm a fan of Family Guy, and there's lots of skits where Peter will be, digging for gold, as my mother used to say, and thinking that no one can see him doing that disgusting thing. So, that's what happens. People think they're safe, and that's what happens in road rage situations too, because people think that they can sort of act within their vehicle in ways that they would never do if it was a confrontation outside of that environment. And so it gives us a false sense of that, and it brings out parts of us that are not very attractive. Now, I'm also a big believer in free speech, and so I think that, free speech is protected, fortunately, in this country, and it's something that wherever we were, whatever country or place we'd be from, I would hope that we'd find a way to honor that greatly. And free speech must include things that I don't like, you know? So what are we to do with that? How do I deal with people that are being trollish on the internet or social media? So now that we kind of have that background, here's what I would suggest, and here's how I've tried to deal with it. First of all, I don't like the use of ad hominem attacks, and basically that means to call people names. So if someone, uses an expression like a troll for someone, that's a very easy way to kind of a very cheap and sort of unintelligent way to kind of just label someone so they don't have to address what's happening. And I really don't think that there's anything mindful about calling people names. Secondly, when I'm speaking, and it's part of the practice of mindful living, and it comes out of the Buddhist tradition, is that one of the ways, one of the parts of the path to living, freely and fully, and that is right speech. So in the Buddhist tradition, in some presentations of the Buddhist teachings, they present the the diagnosis of why we suffer, and then they present a treatment, and that treatment plan has 8 parts. The diagnosis has 4 parts, and the treatment plan has 8 parts. And one of those 8 parts is right speech. Now, the word right in this situation here is also related to a Sanskrit word that means noble. And so it's saying that right relation or right speech is noble speech. So now what does that mean, right? Okay. So noble in this sense means that I'm going to live in a way that is transcendent of my base conditioning, so that I'm not living just out of the reaction of my conditioning as a human being, but I'm living nobly, and I'm transcending the more baser and banal aspects of my conditioning. And we know what being noble means. There's different ways to define it, but we all know what it means. And so right or noble speech means that I'm going to be mindful about the things that I say. Now, that doesn't mean that I can't pay attention to the environment I'm in. So, for example, if I'm among a certain circle of friends, I might speak in a way that is more casual, or I might speak in a way where there's a lingo or language we have, because every group has their own special language. So, you talk to an accountant or a lawyer, they have their own special language. Sports have their own special language, and so when you're in that circle, you're going to have this common lingo, and you're comfortable there. But when you're talking outside of that, I think it's really important that you be very mindful that what you're saying is noble or right. Now, what does that mean for me? What that means for me, coming from the perspective of oneness, is that I want to speak in such a way that I'm connecting people as much as I can. In other words, I don't want my speech to necessarily separate me from you. Now, that's not always possible. I mean, there are some situations, no matter what I say, you may interpret it in a way that I didn't intend, or you may interpret it in a way that's negative. So there's a certain place where I don't have much control. And, I don't think people should ever necessarily not speak their truth, or that that right speech or noble speech should inhibit them from speaking what they perceive as truth. It's a different intention. My intention is to be clear, connected and ultimately compassionate people. So, for example, I've had some of my stuff trolled, not very often, but occasionally I have some of my stuff trolled. And a recent example was someone that, because of the Ask Sensei Tony episodes that have become popular, people sometimes on Facebook or some social media outlet that's advertising the AskSenseiTony.com website or my podcast or YouTube channel. You might have someone comment or say something that, it could be called trollish. And what I try to do in those situations is, number one, not take it personally, because a lot of times I think people that they're trying to be humorous and they're trying to just trying to be clever and trying to be humorous. So they might ask me a question that seems pretty ridiculous, right? And the way that I've found that has really helped is that even if they're saying something that is kind of ridiculous, I'll take what they're saying at face matter, and I will kind of address it. You know, so if someone says something ridiculous to me, like, "Dear Sensei, why is my why does my poop look green?" And believe it or not, I had something similar to that. So why look? Well, so they're saying that to be funny and clever, and I get it. But I will. And then what I will do is I'll say, well, let's talk about you know let's talk about what's that book my son had as a kid? Everybody poops. Let's talk about that. And so I'll go at it from the cosmic perspective, where I'll get into the science and kind of say, well, the color of our excrement is based on the foods that we eat and maybe the health of our gut and things like that. And then I'll kind of get into how those things can affect the mind, the way that we feel and think. And I'll kind of go at it like that and kind of just be sincere in my approach. And what I've found is that really works, because people are expecting you to retaliate, right? And I think everybody has a right to defend themselves. And I think we all enjoy it when people sometimes put down the veneers of good civilized society and just speak their minds. I think we all find that humorous and somewhat refreshing. So I think you just have to strike a balance. I know, number one, that if someone says something about me, I've talked before about the spiritual Bill of Rights. I have the right to not engage that person. I have the right to not engage them because, sometimes, as my grandfather used to say, trying to have a dialogue or an argument or discussion with someone who's made up their mind or who's not interested in really having that dialogue is like wrestling with a pig. All you do is end up smelly and filthy, and the pig enjoys it way too much. Remember that. So you have the right to not wrestle with pigs. You have the right to not do that. Secondly, you do have the right to protect yourself and defend yourself, and I think you should. I think that there's certainly cases where it could be slanderous, where someone's saying something about you, and that what they're saying could affect you personally beyond just the way you emotionally feel about what they said, but it might affect your income, it might affect, things of that nature. So in that case, then you should talk to your lawyer and find out what things truly are slanderous and not. And I think you have a right to protect yourself. As a matter of fact, I think one of the things you should do that when you're under attack from someone is really take time to think whether you want to engage it. And if you're going to engage it, then you have the right to protect yourself, and the one thing you shouldn't do is make a decision out of fear. Now, you can make a decision out of not wanting to engage something because, it's just not worth it. It's too messy, like I said. Or, You just don't want to. You just decided that you don't really need to do that. But if you do engage, then I think you have to engage in a way that is going to be effective. And you do have the right to protect yourself. So, again, maybe then you want to see, is this a slander situation? And you might want to investigate that, and you might want to push back from a legal perspective. But honestly, in the majority of the communication that we might do, I think that the psychological disarmament or the psychic jujitsu technique that we teach in the 4 directions system of mindfulness, which you can find in my book, Free Your Mind, or the 3 Principles of Oneness. I think that's the best way to go. And if you've been listening to me for a while, or you've read any of my books, you kind of know this process, but I'll just kind of briefly give it to you because, you might want to try practicing it yourself. And the only caveat I would say is that all these practices work better if they're coming from the full foundation of a mindfulness practice. If you take bits and pieces here and there, it's not that they might not be effective, but the effectiveness of them could be altered by the depth of which you are coming into the experience. So you should kind of do it all, learn it all. So if someone says something, writes something to me, let's say on a social media feed, and I feel like I want to engage, and I don't feel that I need to pursue whether or not it's slanderous, then I will disarm them. And how do I do that? Well, I want to find, so the first step in a disarmament is to acknowledge how I'm feeling. Again, this doesn't have to take very long, but you want to acknowledge how you're feeling. So if you're angry or you're afraid or you're upset, whatever it is, you got to kind of breathe and kind of acknowledge that. And I recommend a thing I call the wave breath, where you kind of imagine as you breathe in, a nice cool or warm water flows over you and out your feet. And believe it or not, you do that a few times and you just visualize that washing all that away. It's very effective. But you got to acknowledge how you're feeling. If you don't, whatever actions you take will either will be more reactive and coming from a place of fear, or a sense of powerlessness, or a sense of confusion, or a sense of anger. But if you can acknowledge things, or a sense of being a goody two shoes, I'm going to say something nice and kind back because I'm such a great guy. That kind of stuff's all false, and what you want to do is just acknowledge it. So if I acknowledge it, I'll say, well, that really ticks me off. That really pisses me off what that person said, and kind of just acknowledge it and then release it. And the second step I want to do is find something which I can agree with them, and that means that I want to find something that I can say or write that will agree with them. Maybe I can only find, like, out of 100%, I might only find 1% I can agree with. Or I might agree with them temporarily about something as a sort of heuristic or functional way to kind of get past the attack. But it doesn't mean I have to agree with them all the time about that. Maybe I can just find something I can agree with. But I found most of the time, if you're really honest about yourself and you're really honest about who you are, and you've learned to practice radical self-acceptance, and you've learned to integrate harmoniously in the goal of oneness or wholeness, and you're not living out of perfection, and you have a meditative and mindful practice that's helping you to transcend your habitual conditioning that's creating suffering, then it's not hard to do. It's not hard to do. And then when you know you've disarmed them, is that they won't say anything back. They won't say anything back. Or they might actually say something back that actually is better, and they'll try to connect with you. And part of the reason that works is because our brains kind of react that way. When we're presented with a certain sort of process, our brains are conditioned to sort of react. So when you agree with someone about something, it's very hard for their brain to kind of logically figure that out because they thought you were going to fight them. They thought you were going to disagree with them. So when you agree, they're like, you can tell they're off balance. And they'll sort of stumble around for words, or they might say anything. And if you don't rush in to fill that space, sometimes they'll come up with something that, helps get the conversation going in a better direction. But a lot of times they won't say anything. The other thing you can do is you can redirect them once you have them disarmed. So once they don't know what to say, then you can take them in a different direction. And as I said, like an example where someone says something like, "Dear Sensei Tony, why is the sky blue?" Or something more crude or whatever. One way of disarming them is sort of to agree with their question and try to respond to it sincerely, even if it's a completely silly question. And that often does the trick. Because ultimately my goal is to live mindfully. Why? Why do I want to do that? Because it's better. How do I measure that? Well, because I'm happier, I'm stronger, I enjoy things more, I'm more resilient to stress, and when bad shit happens, I know how to address it much better. And when I do get hooked by things, it doesn't last as long. Essentially, when you take up this path, and again, it's rooted in the teachings of the Buddha Shakyamuni. And the Buddha Shakyamuni was essentially saying that, look, life's rough, man. Life is rough. But you can choose to live nobly. You can choose to live freely. You can choose to not be dictated by your conditioning. You can choose to love beyond the boundaries that you've been conditioned by. You can choose to give from a source of clarity, compassion, connection, and creativity. It's like an endless well. You can choose to realize the oneness of all life. So, anyhow, I hope that this was helpful to you, Martin, and try it and let me know how it goes. Thank you.
You've been listening to Ask Sensei Tony. Please visit our website at AskSenseiTony.com, check out Sensei's books and videos, and become a part of the Dragonfly spiritual lifestyle.